Welcome to C-Suite on Your Street, a show where we talk about what you need to know to start, run, and grow your small business. I'm LaTanya Howard, your host and a fellow small business owner of Howard Corporate Center right here in the city of Laurel. On this program, we speak with entrepreneurs and experts on a wide range of business topics. Our goal, to share resources, tips, and tricks to help you operate and think like a CEO, wherever you are on your entrepreneurial journey. Today's guest is attorney Elsa W. Smith, founder of the law offices of Elsa W. Smith, LLC. Attorney Smith opened her firm in 2012 right here in the city of Laurel and recently added another office in Annapolis. One of Attorney Smith's practice areas is business law, and today she will discuss common ways to structure your business and some of the legal considerations. Attorney Smith, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, LaTanya, and hello to your viewers as well. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
It's a pleasure, and congratulations on being in business for 6 years.
Thank you, thank you. It's a real treat being on your show, you know, because you've seen the development and the growth of my firm starting in 2012. So again, thank you.
Yes, and it's been a pleasure seeing you grow, seeing all of the services that you provide to your diverse clientele. And we've really been on this journey together for the last 6 years, and I look forward to 60 plus more years of it. How about that?
Yes, ma'am, indeed.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your entrepreneurial journey?
Okay. Well, as you noted that I did start my firm in 2012. Actually, it was like the last quarter in 2012. But I came to Maryland from Florida with over 15 years of legal experience. I'll go back a little farther. I graduated from the University of Miami School of Business immediately before starting University of Miami School of Law. So I do have that business foundation. I was an entrepreneur. I had my own firm in Florida. When I came to the Metro DC area, I worked in Washington, DC as an attorney for a number of years, made a lot of good money. It was great, exciting, but there was a void. I have always had a heart for service and serving others. So that part of my life was unfulfilled. So I sought for a way to give back to the community. So pretty, like in 2011, 2010, I started thinking about launching a business again, because I've always had that entrepreneurial bug. And I finally had the opportunity in the last quarter of 2012 to launch my law offices, and as you said, here in Laurel. In Laurel, you know, it was very deliberate, my choice of where I was going to start my business. I looked at census data, and I still do have a particular interest in serving the Hispanic community. I am Afro-Cuban. My parents came here from Cuba, fleeing communism, and you know, we have a long line of entrepreneurs in our family. So as I said, I had a need and a desire to serve the Hispanic population, which according to the census data is seeing continual growth just in Laurel. And Laurel is in that sweet spot, you know, of, you know, you can serve Prince George's County, Anne Arundel, and Howard. So it's in a real prime location. So that was another factor in me choosing to set up shop in Laurel. And I practice in a number of areas, and just probably about a year or so ago, I decided to focus the concentration of the firm into business law as one of the many areas. I also do estate planning, but for purposes of this show, I'm focusing on business. And in speaking with just so many business owners, Hispanic and non-Hispanic, I realized that there's so many unmet needs business owners don't realize. So, you know, as a business owner, one of the things you ask yourself is, you know, where is there a need, and how are you uniquely suited to meet that need? So that's what prompted my journey.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Excellent.
I'm really excited.
Very excited for you. So tell us, you're licensed both in Maryland and DC, is that right?
That's correct. That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay. And you also are able to practice at the federal level, including the Supreme Court of the United States,
That too is correct. I am licensed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland, and I'm also barred in the Supreme Court of the United States.
Very impressive. And another interesting fact about you is that you're bilingual.
I am. I'm Spanish-English bilingual, and I don't remember what language I learned first, and people ask me that all the time, but that's the blessing of growing up in a bilingual household.
Right. Well, that certainly is a major differentiator, I would imagine.
It is. Again, you're always looking at what sets you apart from competitors in your field. Based on what I've learned, there really is a dearth of attorneys in this area who are fluent in Spanish. And the clients that I've had and people in the community that I've spoken to really value that. And it's even more than the language connection, it's the cultural connection too that they appreciate. So I absolutely agree that sets me apart and able to provide a higher level of service to all my clients.
Right, very good. So today, as I mentioned in the opening, we're going to talk about common business structures that businesses can select to organize themselves legally. And there are a number out there, but we're going to narrow our discussion to just 3 or 4 of them. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us exactly what a business structure is and why it's important?
Well, a business structure, legal, it's how the state, in this case, the state of Maryland or any state, recognizes you in the eyes of the law. That's, a business structure involves, in the case of a corporation, you have officers, for example. It's how you're set up. So in a nutshell, that's what a business structure is. And it's how you are seen in the eyes of the market.
Right, right. And one of the reasons why it's important, I imagine there are a number of reasons why it's important to organize yourself formally, but it's liability exposure too that entrepreneurs ought to be concerned about. Is that right?
Indeed, and we're going to get into the liability issues in our discussion, but absolutely. Right.
And of course, just for the sake of our viewers, what you're telling us today is simply for educational and informational purposes. Is that right? We don't want to get you in trouble. So.
It is. Everything that we're discussing is for informational purposes only. No attorney-client relationship should be formed with anything that we're discussing today. And if you are in need of legal advice, you're encouraged to seek advice and counsel from a licensed attorney in your state.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you for taking care of that detail for us.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about some of the common business structures that entrepreneurs can choose from. Let's start with the sole proprietorship business structure. Tell us what this structure is.
Okay, well, a sole proprietorship, it's very common and it's really easy because it's a simple and most common structure. It's an unincorporated business owned by a single individual. And there is no distinction between you and the business. Again, we'll get into liability in a moment. But you, as the proprietor, the sole proprietor, are entitled to all profits, but you're also responsible for all the business debts.
Right. Okay, so it's good and bad. And like you said, we'll talk about some of the legal ramifications a little bit later, but sole proprietorship is the easiest to set up.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
Now let's talk about partnership. Now there are, I guess, 2 primary types of partnership, general and limited, but let's talk specifically about general partnerships.
There are actually a couple other types of partnerships, but you're right. For general partnership is easy. It's like a sole proprietorship, but with more than one person. It's where 2 or more people share in ownership of the business. Each partner contributes to all aspects of the business, including money, property, labor, so forth. But each partner also shares in the profit and losses of the business.
Okay, so the sole proprietorship and the general partnership are similar in terms of how, I guess, debts and assets are treated as far as the business is concerned, but they're different because a sole proprietorship has one owner, whereas a general partnership has 2 or more.
Correct.
Okay, excellent. All right, so let's talk about limited liability companies. This, again, is another common business structure, particularly among small businesses. Tell us about the limited liability company.
The limited liability company, or LLCs, as they're commonly called, it's a hybrid legal structure, and it provides limited liability features of a corporation, which we'll talk about in a moment, but it has the tax benefits and operational flexibility of a partnership. The owners of an LLC, and this is important, they are called members.
Right.
Right. And those members can consist of another individual, another corporation, or another LLC.
Okay.
And there are no limits in terms of the number of members
Okay.
that an LLC can have.
Okay. And then the last business structure that we'll talk about is the corporation. Here again, there are multiple types of corporations, but for our discussion today, let's talk about stock corporations.
Absolutely. As you said, it's the most general type of corporation, and it must have at least 3 officers, a president, secretary, and a treasurer, and at least 1 director. And it's owned by the shareholders, which may be individuals or other business entities.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that provides the viewers a good overview of what these different business structures are in terms of what they offer, how you organize, and how they might differ from one another just from a formation standpoint. So now let's talk about some of the pros and cons from a legal perspective of each of these structures, because that's something equally, if not more important, that I think business owners should consider when they're selecting a business structure.
Indeed.
So, all right, so let's start with the sole proprietorship. What are some legal pros and cons that entrepreneurs ought to consider with this particular model?
Okay, well, for the sole proprietorship, what the first pro is that it costs nothing to set up. Another pro is that you report the net income or loss on your personal income tax return. The operator of a sole proprietorship has full managerial control of the business. There are really no corporate formalities to set up a sole proprietorship, and there's no minutes or meeting notes that you have to take as a sole proprietor.
Okay, so those are some of the advantages.
Some of
or
the
pros.
advantages.
Okay.
It's very simple.
Okay.
Of all the entities. Now, the cons. You're personally liable for all the debts incurred as a sole proprietor. Creditors, and I can't stress this enough, as a sole proprietor, if someone sues you, if your Betty sues, muffins, or bakery, people can sue you. They can come after your home, your car, your bank accounts, because there is no distinction between you and the business entity. It's all you.
Right.
So
right.
you're putting yourself at tremendous risk
Right.
by operating as a sole proprietor.
And I think another important key is that if a business or if an entrepreneur or an aspiring entrepreneur doesn't legally form as another type of business structure, the default business structure is sole proprietorship. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
It's a single.
All right. All right, so the key takeaway there as far as the benefits of the sole proprietorship is that it's easy to set up and basically cost-free, but there's no liability protection. So the business and the individual are one and the same.
Right, and depending on, just as a footnote, depending on your state, there may be other licensing regulations, but you have to check with your state.
Right. Okay, so now let's talk about the general partnership.
Yes, what I call as a marriage.
Why do you call it as a marriage? I'm interested.
It is, and anytime you enter into a partner, any kind of partnership, we're talking about a general partnership in this instance, but individuals should view it as a marriage, and because you're sharing your finances, the operation of something that you're putting your sweat equity in to build. So you need to be able to trust the person that you're going into business with. I've seen many times where people go into partnership with one another, and it's because one person is more financially well off, but the not so well off partner really doesn't have a good relationship or really doesn't know the individual with the resources. And then, 1 year in, you realize that, this other partner is a pain to deal with, is not trustworthy at all, and you've realized that, you've made an error. And it's better to know that ahead of time. So I tell people, be deliberate. Just like you are in a marriage in choosing your partner, be deliberate about the process.
Very good advice. Thank you. View as a marriage.
Exactly.
So with that in mind, tell us about some of the pros and cons from a legal perspective of the general partnership.
Certainly. One of the advantages or pros is that, two heads are always better than one. You have someone to bounce ideas off of, and, you don't feel like you're going it alone. You potentially have a greater borrowing capacity because you're dealing with, the credit histories of two individuals as opposed to one. There are no corporate formalities to set up a general partnership, such as meeting minutes that we'll discuss in a minute. And the partners divide the profits and losses. And there's no, other than complying with any state or local licensing requirements, there's no real formalities in forming a general partnership. Now the cons. The liabilities for the debts of the partnership is unlimited. Each partner is what's called joint and several. Some of your viewers may be familiar with that term. You're not, as a partner, you're not only liable for the debts you incur, but you're liable for the debts that the partnership incurs.
Wow.
Joint and several. So that's important. This is why I said be deliberate in who you choose as a partner.
Right.
Each partner is considered, in the eyes of the law, an agent of the partnership. So you could be subject to liability depending on the situation if your partner, commits, violates the law. Mm-hmm. I'll leave it at that. Your partnership you could be liable as well.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, when you're dealing with a partnership and maybe with the other business structures that you're going to tell us the pros and cons of, what about dissolving the business? I would imagine if you have partnerships or other types of people that you're involved with the business with, dissolving it can be complicated too.
Indeed, and that's why it's important for entities to have an operating agreement. And that sets forth the responsibilities of each partner, of each owner. And I also encourage, at least in my practice, individuals to have buy and sell agreements that may be going beyond the scope of our conversation here today. But it's sort of like a prenuptial agreement for business. Mm-hmm. And it just makes the process easier. If one person wants to leave the business, all the terms are written out, what the value of the business is, and it just makes everything pretty seamless. So,
okay. Mm-hmm. Very good. So now let's talk about the pros and cons of the limited liability company, the LLC.
Mm-hmm. Well, one pro is that the LLC is considered separate from its members. And the members' liability is limited to the amount of their investment in the LLC. Okay. And there are really no restrictions in terms of the number of members that an LLC has, and I mentioned that earlier. The cons are, one con in particular is that you're subject to self-employment taxes. And depending on what you do, if you don't, as a business owner, keep adequate records, if you don't keep the records of the business separate from your personal banking.
Okay, so now that you've told us some of the pros of the LLC, what are some of the cons from a legal perspective?
Well, as I mentioned in the pros, the LLC may be viewed separate and distinct from the owners or the members, I should say. The IRS doesn't necessarily view it separately, and particularly in the case of sole member LLCs or single member LLCs. And another con is that you're subject to self-employment taxes. And you, as a sole member LLC, you'd fill out what's called a Schedule C, and you would attach that to your 1040 tax return.
Right. And I think another con, like from an operational perspective, is the importance of keeping your personal and your business records separate. Is that right?
Absolutely. I stress this to clients and other individuals that I meet, is that of that very point. It's not a good idea, and I'm sure your CPAs or your accountants will thank you for establishing business accounts and running all the deposits and disbursements of the business through the business accounts. It's not only easier to follow from an accounting standpoint, but if you're ever audited by the IRS, it's easier to see that this is in fact a legitimate business and you're not commingling funds. One problem that I see is business owners dipping into the business bank account to pay some of their personal expenses, vacation, car. Now car, let me put a footnote there. If the car is only used for personal use, then you should not be paying it from the business account. If it is, however, then everything should be run for the business. But the point is to maintain that distinction.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And that's interesting because when I was doing research for my book earlier this year, one of the things I learned, and I didn't really know this until I started doing the research, is that with the LLC and maybe with some of the other business structures too, that corporate veil can be pierced if you don't keep your business operations and your personal operations separate. Indeed.
Now that concept of piercing the corporate veil, which some of your viewers may be familiar with, that's a legal concept.
Right.
If someone sues you, right, as an LLC, and they're piercing the corporate veil means that they're going through that wall of corporate status to go to to attack you personally from a legal standpoint. And the way you avoid that is doing what I just suggested, making sure that your records are spot on and distinct from anything personal. That way your opposing party won't have an argument to say, well, they've been commingling since they started, look at all these bank records.
Right.
So.
Right. Very good point.
Important.
Thank you for that. And then lastly, let's talk about the pros and cons of the stock corporation structure.
Yes. Some of the advantages of the pros are that the ability to issue stock is very attractive to potential investors. Okay. And then the creditors cannot go after the shareholders. They're going after the corporation. So there's that buffer. Okay. There's that protection. Another thing is that a corporation has the right to free speech, just like individuals do. Now, some of the cons of a corporation, there are a lot more formalities involved, such as holding board meetings, taking minutes, and creating bylaws. So it's a lot more cumbersome than some of the other entities that we've covered. Traditional corporations' profits are subject to double taxation. What do I mean? They're taxed once at the corporate level and then again when profits are dispersed to the owners. Okay. So they're taxed again, double taxation. Another con is that corporations are relatively harder to form. They're obviously not impossible, but they're harder to form, comparatively speaking, than the other entities.
Right. Well, wow, this is a lot for people to think about because I guess two different things I want to talk about in the context of the pros and cons of business structures. And we talked about this a little bit before we began taping, but me personally, you may feel differently. I think it's important that business owners formally structure a business, even if they consider what they do to be a hobby or something they just do on the side. To use your example in the beginning of you just bake cakes for your friends and church members or whatever the case may be. And tell me if I'm off tangent on this, but if you're doing anything that you're collecting money from people in exchange for a product or service, you have a business, whether you regard it as a business or not. And if you have a business, you need to have all your ducks in a row and in order, starting by formally registering and structuring your business.
That's a great point, LaTanya. And following that same example, and I can think of other examples, and we probably all know some individual from our church or community group who's excellent at baking cakes, and everybody wants this person's cakes. So she bakes and she's selling and she's making a lot of money until someone gets sick.
Exactly.
Okay. and it's directly, and they can tie it to one of her cakes. It's not a question. So now this individual is not incorporated, so all of her assets are at risk. Okay, not to mention the fact that she didn't bother to get any licenses from the Department of Health and any other requirements that are needed in order to sell food to the public.
Right.
Those regulations are in place to protect consumers.
Exactly.
So, this individual in our hypothetical is setting herself up for a world of hurt. I mean, she could conceivably lose everything depending on the degree of injury suffered by this individual who purchased from her.
Right. And then the reverse side of that is that we as consumers need to be mindful of the businesses that we do business with. Are they actually legally registered? Are they legitimate? Or are they someone just doing something fly by night, so that you can mitigate that risk to yourself?
And another great point is that the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation, or SDAT, has a website that, and it's free and open to the public, and you can actually check whether somebody is registered.
Right.
You can do a business search and just type in that business name, Betty's Cupcakes or whatever. You can type that in, and if it pops up, you can see if that person is a registered Maryland business entity.
Right. Right.
Whether they filed everything, if they're up to date on their taxes and so forth. You can see all of that online.
Right. Very good information.
And that's in the Maryland.gov website.
Yep. So you've given us a lot of good information about the different business structures, or at least 4 of the common ones that business owners can choose from, and some of the pros and cons from a legal perspective. And what we like to do at the end of each show is provide 3 action items to provide practical steps that our viewers can take today to begin implementing some of the information that we provided today. So this episode's action items are going to be a little bit different because it's a little bit more probative, I think, in terms of what we're suggesting that the viewers do. So for businesses that are not yet structured, there are some questions that you suggest that they ask themselves in terms of identifying what is a good business structure for them. One of them is, how many owners will the business have?
That's correct. And that's important because, you want to see if who's in this with you, who's in this venture, this new exciting venture with you, and what are the responsibilities of each owner?
Right.
Are they just like an equity investor? Are they just putting money up for the business, or are they going to be involved in the operations of the business? But those are things, or ideas and concepts that you need to flesh out before you launch.
So in the case of a person who's going to run the business completely by themselves, the sole proprietorship or the single member LLC might be a good option for them.
I'd be very careful about using good and not a recommendation, but it's the sole proprietorship is where people naturally fall into.
Okay.
But for the liability reasons that we discussed earlier, it's not something that I would advise any of my clients to use. I want to give them the maximum protection possible under the law.
Always the attorney. Very good. And then another probative question for those who have not yet structured themselves is, how many employees and contractors are you considering to have for your business? And why would that be a question that nascent or pre-startup businesses should think about?
Well, the easy answer is because you need to have money to pay these individuals for. And your question actually begs another question that came to mind, is the distinction between, and it's more an employment law question, but you need to think about this too, is are they going to be independent contractors, or are they going to be, in fact, be employees? And there are federal labor laws that you need to be aware of, and that's a discussion for a different day. But in addition to how many employees, the nature of the role of that employee also should be considered. And
Okay, and the extent to which a business is expecting to have employees or contractors, of course, there are employment law considerations, but you're saying that that may also impact the type of business structure that they select for themselves. Okay.
Indeed.
All right, so a second action item is for those businesses that are already established, some probative questions that they might want to ask themselves. The business that you have, or the business structure that you already have, now that you've been in business for a year or however long, is it providing you enough liability?
coverage,
coverage.
absolute
Yes.
liability coverage. And that's a fair question. And, a business goes through different phases of its development. We'll call it a business life cycle. And it's okay for you to re-examine whether you have these liability coverage at different points in your business's development. That's why it's so important to consult, at a minimum, consult with a legal professional, tax professional. I write a blog, and in that blog, I ask individuals, it's a video blog, and I ask the public, who's on your team of core advisors? And that's a question that's pertinent not just for established businesses, but for those yet to become
Right.
a business.
Right, right. And I think that's an important point, because the way a business starts out and the vision that you have for the business in the beginning may be very different 5 or 6 years down the road. That's certainly been the case in my business. That may very well have been the case in your business.
Yes.
So it hurts to reevaluate, or it doesn't hurt to reevaluate. Maybe it made sense for us to be, for the business to be a sole member LLC in the beginning, but now we've evolved and we have more people on board and we're expanding, so we ought to consider a different structure.
And and to that point, I would say, if you are going to have employees, I personally would advise you against being a sole proprietor, because again, you don't have that protection.
Right.
If something happens and you find yourself in litigation.
Right.
So definitely in a case of, if you are thinking about having employees, that's one entity that I would shy away from.
Okay. And then the third action item, you've alluded to this already, is that there are some free resources that pre-existing and existing businesses can go to for information about perhaps setting up their business or restructuring their business. And in the state of Maryland, that's the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation. What are some other resources?
Yes, the Maryland ESTAT site, you can find that at maryland.gov. And it was helpful for me as a business owner. I'm not just an attorney. I'm a business owner and entrepreneur as well. So that site has plenty of free resources, frequently asked questions, that at least will get you pointed in the right direction. Another great resource is the U.S. Small Business Administration, and that's at sba.gov. Again, plenty of free articles, videos on how to establish a business, how to even write a business plan, but it's got a wealth of resources.
Okay.
So there's a lot of free information out there.
All right, very good. This has been such a fruitful discussion today. So do you have any final thoughts or information you want to give to our viewers before we wrap up today?
I do. And again, I just want to thank you so much. It's such an honor to be on your show. And thank you for the opportunity. What I would say to your viewers is, to be very deliberate when you are thinking about starting a business. It's more than just a hobby, and laying the foundation is so important. Consulting with an attorney or other professional will just put you on the path to success. So, don't be, penny wise and pound foolish, as the old saying goes. Seek help. There are people out there that want to put you on a path to success. So make the investment early on, and it will pay dividends throughout the life of your business.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Attorney Smith. And thank you for tuning in to C-Suite on Your Street. Be sure to join us next time to learn more about how to start, run, and grow your small business. Until then, be sure to like us on Facebook at C-Suite on Your Street and consider our quote of the month. When the record book on you is finished, let it show your wins and your losses, but don't let it show you didn't try. Take care.